There is a fact buried in the records of the early 18th century that almost no one says out loud, because it sounds like a joke before it sounds like history. In the same Caribbean waters, in the same sickly season, two ships could pass within sight of each other and tell two completely different stories about what it meant to be a sailor in that age. One of them was a vessel of the most powerful navy on Earth. The other was a crew of criminals with a price on every head aboard. And it was the criminals who were more likely to be alive at the end of the voyage. Picture it. A British Royal Navy frigate, sails patched in gray, riding low in the swell off Hispaniola. On her deck, men who can barely stand. Their gums are black and spongy. Old wounds that healed years ago have split open again as if the body has forgotten how to hold itself together. Below decks, where the air is thick enough to cut, men shake with fever and void themselves where they lie. A third of the crew is dead or dying, and not one of them was killed by a cannon or a cutlass. They were killed by the voyage itself. And not 3 miles away, anchored in the lee of a green headland, sits a pirate sloop. Her crew is filthy. Her crew is drunk. Her crew is wanted from London to Port Royal and would be hanged on sight by the men dying on that frigate. And her crew, by almost every measure that mattered, is healthier, better fed, more likely to see another year. The outlaws, the lawless, the human refuse that the age had thrown overboard, had stumbled into something the British state with all its money and all its discipline could not manage. They had learned how to keep men alive at sea. This is the story of how that happened. Not romance, not adventure. It is the story of how a few thousand desperate, condemned men were forced to solve a problem the greatest navy in the world had decided to ignore, and how, for one brief and astonishing window, the worst men on the ocean ran the best system on it. To understand how the criminals came to outsurvive the king's own sailors, we have to go back to the thing that made all of it possible. We have to go back to what it actually cost to serve the crown at sea. In the years after the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, the Atlantic was full of ships and emptier of mercy than at almost any time before it. The Royal Navy that had swollen to fight the war now needed men to hold the peace, and it got them the way it always got them, which is to say it took them. The press gang was not a metaphor. Men were seized from taverns, from merchant decks, from the streets of port towns, and carried aboard warships against their will to serve for years at wages that were often paid late or not at all. A king's ship was a floating town of 300 or 400 men crammed into a space built for war, not for living. And that crowding was the first killer. Below the gun decks, where the men slept in hammocks slung a few inches apart, the air did not move. Lice moved instead from body to body, carrying the typhus that sailors called ship fever, a sickness that could empty a vessel faster than any enemy. The damp never left. The bilge stank. And the food was a slow poison of its own. Salt beef and salt pork packed in barrels years before, hardtack biscuit riddled with weevils, dried peas, beer that turned. For a short cruise it would do. For the long blockades and the long crossings that the Navy demanded, it was a death sentence written in the absence of a single thing. That thing was fresh food. Without fruit, without vegetables, without anything green and living, the body simply begins to come apart. The sailors called it scurvy, and they had watched it kill for generations without understanding why. The gums rot. The teeth loosen. The skin bruises at a touch. Wounds and even old broken bones reopen as the body loses its ability to knit itself together, and a man who seemed merely tired one week is dead the next. On a long naval voyage, scurvy did not take a few men. It took dozens. It took hundreds. Across the 18th century, disease of this kind would kill vastly more of Britain's sailors than every battle the Navy ever fought combined. And here is the part that matters most. The Navy knew the price and paid it anyway, because the structure of the thing made it almost impossible to change. The men were not volunteers to be kept. They were bodies to be replaced. The voyages were dictated by strategy, not by health. The hierarchy ran one direction only, from the quarterdeck down, and a common sailor dying of a disease no one understood had no vote, no voice, and no way to choose a healthier path. The system was rigid, it was hierarchical, it was rich in everything except the one thing that kept men alive, and it would stay that way for most of a century. The men who could not bear it, who deserted or were captured or who simply broke and ran, had to go somewhere. And some of them went to a place where, for the first time in their working lives, the rules were written differently. We do not know his real name, and that is fitting, because the man we are about to follow stands in for hundreds like him. Call him Daniel Hawkins, a ship's surgeon, because that is what a man like him would have been called, and because a name makes it easier to follow him through what comes next. A surgeon at sea in this age was not the gentleman physician of a London street. He was a tradesman of blood and bone, often half-trained, carrying a chest of saws and probes and a few precious medicines, valued for one brutal reason above all others. He could cut. And in a world of cannon and splinter and infection, a man who could cut and stitch and amputate was worth more than gold. That is exactly why men like Hawkins so often ended up among pirates against their will. When a pirate crew took a ship, they did not much care about the cargo of 100 ordinary men. But the surgeon they wanted. They would take him by force, drag him over the rail with his chest of tools, and tell him he sailed with them now, the same way Bartholomew Roberts himself had once been dragged into the trade he came to master. Hawkins did not choose this. He was a king's man or a merchant's man, and now he was a pirate's man, and if he was caught, he would hang beside the rest of them whether he had ever wanted any of it or not. So imagine his first weeks among them and imagine what he expected to find. He expected filth and chaos. He expected to be set to work patching the wounds of brutes who would drink themselves to death and die screaming of fevers in a floating slum worse than any he had left behind. That is what the word pirate promised. Lawlessness, disorder. And disorder, every educated man of the age knew, was the mother of disease. What he found instead unsettled him, and the unsettling is the whole point of this story. The men were rough, yes, and violent. And many of them were doomed. But they ate better than his old crewmates in the Navy had eaten. They were out in the sun and the air instead of rotting below a gun deck. When one of them lost a hand or an eye, there were rules, actual written rules about what he was owed for it. And when Hawkins did his grim arithmetic, the arithmetic a surgeon does without meaning to, counting who lives and who dies, he arrived at a conclusion that he could barely make himself believe. His lawless patients, the condemned, the human wreckage of the age, were outliving the king's men he had left behind. The most disordered crew he had ever served was somehow the healthiest, and he wanted to know why. The why was not magic, and it was not virtue. It was necessity, and necessity turned out to be a better physician than the Royal College of London. The pirates were healthier because almost every choice that the Navy made for the worse, the pirates were forced by their situation to make for the better, and they made those choices not out of wisdom but out of appetite and self-interest and the simple desire of free men to live well while they could. Start with the food because the food was everything. A pirate crew did not sail blockades or wait off a foreign coast for months at the command of an admiral. They went where the prizes were, which meant they went where the ships were, which meant they were rarely far from land and rarely long without taking a vessel loaded with provisions. When they raided, they did not raid only for gold. They raided for turtles and live hogs and chickens, for limes and oranges and lemons, for fresh vegetables and casks of good wine, for everything the body needed, and the Navy denied it. A pirate ship was, by happy accident, supplied the way a healthy body needs to be supplied, in fresh and varied food taken constantly from the rich traffic of the seas. The scurvy that gutted the Navy's long voyages simply had less time and less opening to take hold. Then there were the numbers and the air. A pirate sloop or brig carried a fraction of the men a warship did, which meant less of the deadly crowding that bred ship fever, and more of every barrel of provisions for each mouth aboard. They kept their vessels in a way the Navy's strategic demands rarely allowed, hauling them ashore in quiet coves to scrape the hulls clean, a process called careening, which meant time spent on land, in the sun, breathing air that moved. They were not better men. They were men in better conditions, and the difference showed in their bodies. By the cold arithmetic of survival, a sailor in this age stood a meaningfully better chance of living through the year as a hunted criminal than as a servant of the most powerful navy on the planet. And yet Daniel Hawkins, watching all this, understood something his rougher shipmates did not, and it troubled him. Every single one of these advantages was improvised. Every one of them was fragile. There were no hospitals. There was no supply chain, no storehouse, no state behind them to send help when help was needed. The fresh food lasted only until the next prize. The healthy cove lasted only until a warship was sighted. The whole system, if you could even call it a system, was a thing of luck and motion and appetite, held together by nothing but the constant good fortune of the hunt. It worked beautifully right up until the moment it didn't. And the thing that would break it when it came would not be a thing they could outrun or outvote. But that reckoning was still ahead. First, Hawkins had to understand the strangest part of all, the part that turned a lucky accident into something that almost deserved to be called a design. Because there was a design, and it was written down. It was not in the food or the air, though those kept men alive. The thing that truly separated the pirates from the Navy was a single document, copied and adapted from crew to crew across the Golden Age, that the men signed when they joined and swore to uphold. They called them the Articles. And the Articles were, when you read them with clear eyes, one of the most quietly radical things produced anywhere in the English-speaking world of the early 18th century. The Articles did three things that the Royal Navy did not do, and each of them was a kind of medicine. The first was that they made the crew, not the captain, the final authority. A pirate captain was elected by his men, and except in the heat of a chase or a battle, he could be voted out and replaced if they judged him a coward or a fool or a danger to their lives. A man whose life depended on the choices of his leaders had, for once, a say in those choices. If a captain wanted to drive the crew into waters thick with fever for the sake of a prize, the crew could refuse him. No common sailor in the King's Navy had ever held that power, and the power to refuse a deadly order is, in the most literal sense, the power to stay alive. The second thing the Articles did was share. The plunder of a pirate crew was divided by a written scale that was extraordinarily flat by the standards of the age. A captain might take a share and a half or 2 shares, where an ordinary hand took one. Compare that to a merchant or naval world where the men at the top took fortunes and the men below took scraps, and you begin to see the shape of the thing. And it was not only treasure that was shared. It was risk, and it was care. A crew that ate from a common provision and shared a common fate had every reason to keep one another fed and well, because the man beside you at the rail was the man who would board the next prize with you, and a sick crewmate was a danger to all. The third thing the Articles did is the thing Daniel Hawkins would have read with the strangest feeling of all, because it was, centuries before the phrase existed, a form of insurance. Written plainly into the Articles of crew after crew was a schedule of compensation for the men who were maimed in the work, paid out of the common fund before any treasure was divided. 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for the left, 500 for a right leg, 400 for a left, 100 for the loss of an eye, and 100 for a finger. A man who gave his body to the venture was owed for it, in writing, by the agreement of every man who signed. The Royal Navy, which sent its sailors into the same fire, offered the maimed and the broken charity at best and the gutter at worst. Read those lines again and hear what they actually are. 600 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 500 for the left. They are grim and they are crude, and they reduce a man's body to a column of figures, but they are also a promise. They are a society of the condemned saying to each one of its members, "You matter enough that we will not simply throw you away." And it was precisely the absence of that promise, the Navy's bottomless willingness to throw its men away, that filled the sick bays with the dying. The misdirection of the entire age was that lawlessness meant filth and chaos and death, while order and hierarchy meant safety. Hawkins had crossed the line between those two worlds, and he had found the truth reversed. The disorder hid an order, and the order had been hiding a kind of death. For a few short years, that hidden order ran at its strange peak, and the sight of it is worth holding in the mind. Picture a pirate crew at the height of the Golden Age, somewhere in the warm green islands of the Caribbean, choosing their next move not by an admiral's command, but by their own argument and their own vote. They have just taken a Portuguese trader loaded with fruit and live animals, and for now no man aboard will want for fresh food. They have careened their vessel in a hidden cove, and the men have spent days ashore in the sun with the sweet land air in their lungs. The surgeon's chest is full, taken from 3 captured ships, the most valuable plunder of all, and reserved for the man who keeps them whole. A crewman who lost 2 fingers boarding the last prize has just been paid his 100 pieces of 8 apiece from the common fund, in front of the whole company, exactly as the articles promised. Another who took a splinter through the calf is healing in the shade rather than rotting in a hold. When the captain proposes a course that would carry them into a stretch of coast known for fever, the men talk it over and vote it down, and the captain, who serves at their pleasure, accepts the verdict and turns the ship. This is what it looked like when the system worked. A floating, lawless, doomed little republic that had, almost by accident, assembled nearly every ingredient of survival that the greatest navy in the world was failing to provide. Better food, better air, fewer bodies in less space, a voice in their own fate, and a written promise that no man would be discarded. And then, every so often, came the thing that no vote could touch. Because there was an enemy in those warm green islands that did not care about articles, or elections, or fresh fruit, or how flat you shared the plunder. It came up out of the swamps and the mangrove shallows on the wings of the mosquito, though no one in that age knew the cause. It was carried in the blood and the water and the close air of the tropics. The sailors had names for its faces. The yellow fever, that turned a man's skin the color of old wax and made him vomit black. The intermittent fever they called the ague. The malaria that would burn and freeze a man by turns until it killed him or left him a husk. The bloody flux, the dysentery that emptied a body of everything until there was nothing left to lose. These were the diseases that no human system could outvote, and they fell on everyone. They fell on the Navy hardest of all, in those notorious sickly seasons where a squadron sent to the West Indies might bury half its men in a single summer without firing a shot, and where the coast of West Africa earned a reputation so deadly that sailors spoke of it as a grave that swallowed white men whole. But they fell on the pirates too. All the fresh food in the world is no shield against the fever of a mosquito no one can see. All the careening and the sunlight and the shared provision cannot legislate away an epidemic. The articles could give a man a vote on his captain. They could not give him a vote on the sickness in his own blood. And this is where the fragile heart of the whole thing finally shows itself. The pirates had built a machine for surviving the slow, structural death of bad food and bad air and indifference, the death the Navy chose by neglect. They had built nothing at all against the fast, blind death of the tropical fever, because nobody in the world had, because the cause would not be understood for another century and a half. Their advantage was real and it was earned, but it had an edge to it, a hard limit written into the climate they sailed. They could out-organize the Navy. They could not out-organize a microbe. And sooner or later in those warm and beautiful and lethal waters, the season would come when the thing they could not fight came aboard. If you are finding the truth of this stranger and grimmer than the legend, the way the best history usually is, take a moment and subscribe, because the stories the textbooks skip go up here every week. Now let us follow Daniel Hawkins into the one season his system could not save. Return to those waters off Hispaniola where we began, and to the surgeon's chest and the ledger Daniel Hawkins kept. The crew had done everything right by their own hard wisdom. They had fresh food in the hold. They had a clean careened hull and men with the sun still on their backs. They had voted, only weeks before, to avoid the worst of the fever coast. And it did not matter because the fever came to them. It came aboard in the blood of two men they had taken from a captured ship, or perhaps in the water they had filled from a green and stagnant shore. And within days, the first of their own was shaking in his hammock with the burning and the freezing that every sailor learned to dread. Hawkins did what a surgeon of his age could do, which was almost nothing, and he knew it. He could bleed a man, which weakened him. He could dose him with the bitter bark that sometimes broke the worst of the ague and which he hoarded like the treasure it was. He could give him water and clean linen and the shade of an awning, and he could write his name in the ledger and wait. One man, then three, then a dozen, sweating and raving in the heat below, their healthy bodies, their well-fed and sun-browned bodies, no defense at all against the thing in their blood. The articles paid out for arms and eyes and fingers, for the wounds of the work. There was no clause, there could be no clause, for a fever that asked no man's permission. And so the same crew that outsurvived the Navy through the long structural sicknesses of the age now died, some of them, of the fast and blind one, and the surgeon's ledger filled with names the way every surgeon's ledger eventually does. This is the hard truth that sits underneath the whole triumphant story, the truth that keeps it honest. The pirates were not invincible, and they did not beat death. What they beat was a particular and avoidable death, the death of neglect and bad food and crowding and indifference, the death the most powerful navy on earth was inflicting on its own men by choice. They proved that that death was a choice, by surviving it. But the other death, the blind one, took its share of them anyway, and no vote and no article and no cove full of citrus could buy a single one of them out of it. When the season passed and the survivors counted themselves, the lesson Hawkins carried was not that he had won. It was that the system he had come to respect was a roof against the rain and not a roof against the sky. It kept out the slow weather of the age, the scurvy and the ship fever and the cruelty, and it kept it out better than the Navy's whole hierarchy ever managed. But against the lightning of the tropics, it offered only what every human thing offers in the end, which is company and care, and a name written down so that the dead are at least counted. The crew that could outthink a navy could not outthink a mosquito, and the men who had built the best system on the ocean learned, in a single bad season, exactly where its edges were. The golden age of piracy did not last, and the strange small republics of the articles went down with it, hunted to extinction by the very navy they had quietly outsurvived. The hangings came, in their hundreds. The articles were burned or filed away as evidence. The men who had voted on their own fates went to the gallows or the bottom, and the floating experiment in keeping the condemned alive ended as abruptly as it had begun. By any ordinary telling, that is the end of it, a footnote, a curiosity, a few criminals who happen to eat better than their pursuers. But history has a longer memory than the gallows, and the deepest irony of the whole story is what came after. The Royal Navy that had buried so many of its men in the sickly seasons was not blind forever. In 1747, a naval surgeon named James Lind ran a careful trial aboard ship and showed, as plainly as the age could show anything, that citrus fruit cured and prevented the scurvy that had gutted the fleet for generations. The cure was known. And then, in one of the great damning delays of medical history, the Navy did almost nothing about it for nearly 50 years, until at last, in 1795, lemon juice became standard issue, and the disease that had killed more British sailors than any enemy simply began to vanish from the fleet. The same hierarchy that took half a century to act on a proven cure had been quietly outsurvived, decades earlier, by outlaws who never proved anything and simply ate the fresh fruit because it was there. So consider what the pirates actually demonstrated, stripped of the romance and the black flags. They were not better men than the sailors of the Navy. They were, in the main, worse, by any standard of law or mercy you care to name. But they were men placed by desperation into a different set of conditions, and forced by their own appetite and self-interest to make, again and again, the small rational choices that kept bodies alive, the choices the great, rich, rigid institution could not bring itself to make. Eat fresh, crowd less, share the risk, give the dying a voice and the maimed a promise. None of it was genius. All of it was available to the most powerful navy on Earth, and the Navy refused it because hierarchy is slow and abundance breeds indifference, and the men at the top did not have to lie in the hammocks of the men at the bottom. That is the lesson the surgeon's ledger leaves us, and it has not aged a single day. Necessity is a harder and more honest teacher than power. The desperate, who cannot afford to waste a body or ignore a death, will sometimes engineer a better answer than the comfortable who can. And the simplest fixes, the fresh food and the moving air and the counted dead, are precisely the ones that great institutions are slowest to reach for, because they are too obvious to be impressive and too cheap to be defended. It took a fleet of outlaws to live the answer, and half a century more for the empire to admit it. We do not know what became of the man we have called Daniel Hawkins, because he is every surgeon who was dragged over a pirate's rail and lived to count the cost. But somewhere in the records of that age is the last line such a man would have written, the kind of line a surgeon writes when he closes a ledger heavy with names and lighter somehow, with a few that lived who had no right to. The crew was lawless, he might have written, and the crew was doomed, and the crew was the healthiest company of men I ever served. And the king's ships, with all the gold of an empire behind them, went on burying their sailors by the hundred for 50 years after we were gone. If a story like this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind the textbooks leave on the cutting room floor, subscribe right now. We tell the ones they skip, every single week.